Good day. I'm Pastor John Edis. I'd like to talk to you a little bit today about the ministry of deacons in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. Now, deacons are fairly new in our church body, and so I'd like to give you a little overview of the call to be a deacon, of their training in the lay leadership training programs in the districts of Synod, a little overview of the ministry that deacons do today, and their relationship with pastors and with churches. Also, I'd like to briefly talk about the hindrances towards the acceptance of deacons that exist in some parts of the Missouri Synod. This comes from my experience as a pastor who has deacons in my church, and then also as a training or a teacher of deacons. And so I've been teaching in the lay leadership training program of our district for 16 years now. And so I have some insights as I've not only taught those classes, but followed their men, in many cases, through some 12 or 14 years of ministry. First of all, it's important to note that deacon is a calling, sort of like pastor is a calling. 1 Timothy 3, starting at verse 1 to verse 13, talks about qualifications for a deacon, just as it talks about qualifications for a bishop. One follows right after the other, as though deacon and bishop are both offices in the church and should be selected with care. Philippians 1:1 also is a case in which Paul addresses his letter to the church as well as, he says, with the bishops and deacons. And so it's clear that this is a biblical calling. Now, in our district, we have 10 classes in the leadership training program, which can lead towards that. Now, people take these classes for a variety of reasons. Some people just want to grow in their faith. Others want to become more effective at leading in different parts of church ministry. And some of them either want to become a deacon or else may be considering this, and so go to the class as a way of considering the call to be deacon. Now, once people have taken the 10 classes, personally I do not press them to be certified as deacons, because deacon is a calling by God, not just a credential you get after taking some classes, as though you graduate from a program. The call to deacon includes an inner call, something like what the Apostle Paul describes. Also, it takes qualifications, and so they need to meet the spiritual and moral qualifications that are listed in 1 Timothy 3. There's an examination by synodical officials, and then there's the call by the congregation that's also necessary in order to be called as a deacon. Now you notice that this includes the same process that the Augsburg Confession 14 suggests for a proper call, in which there's training, an examination, a call by a congregation, and ordination by synodical officials. And so the call to be a deacon follows that same basic floor plan that the call to be a pastor does. Now, deacon training in our district is an important way of developing a person's skills and knowledge. Now, personally, I approach the Teacher's Eye class I teach as a sort of seminar class. So rather than just assume I need to communicate a lot of information, although that's a part of it, I think that these men are often in their 40s, 50s, even 60s. And so as a result, they already have a good deal of faith development on the whole and experience in church leadership and teaching. And so my focus is more on discussion and problem solving and understanding more than just on information retrieval. There are two basic thrusts in the 10 classes in our leadership training program. One thrust is knowledge or information. And so classes like New Testament, Old Testament, doctrine, and church history mainly focus on getting people to know these facts. Other classes are more based on ministry skill development. And so they include skill-based classes such as evangelism, leadership, preaching, worship, leadership, and caregiving. Now we're required to have 18 class hours. Most of my classes run about 21 to 30 class hours, depending on the topic, because some require more time than others do. Now, our classes also expect homework, something like a college class would, and also field work in the skill-based classes, so that they actually practice important skills of leadership or teaching or caregiving. and that way develop the skills that they need. In order to be certified as deacons in our district, they need to show that they've done about 24 ministry tasks that show skill development and practice. Ordinary things like visiting new members or visiting sick people in the hospital, teaching confirmation, and so forth. So in that way, they're better prepared for church ministry, having had some experience in those areas. Now, our classes are done almost entirely personally in face-to-face meetings. Some other districts, like the Northwest District, do their training online in association with Concordia University. Now, one thing that's really nice about the deacon classes is the cross-fertilization that happens. The men learn that they're in a common ministry, they support each other, give direction to each other, and network together. In a way, this is probably more transparent and close than many pastoral circuits are, in which there may be politics or more competition involved. There's ongoing education for deacons, done in deacon conferences. Some of them attend pastoral conferences. There are regional meetings throughout the district periodically. And so in that way, they continue to work on their skill development and their knowledge. Also, instructors establish a relationship with deacons, and so they can serve as a place for counsel later on as that's needed. Deacons always have oversight, and so there's a pastor immediately in their area, either in their own church or in a nearby church, who oversees what they do. Also, the district president or vice presidents also oversee them, and the district president will renew their licenses every year. So there's a good deal of counsel and oversight to help them in their ministry and to make sure that they don't go off track. More oversight, in fact, than pastors actually have. Now, the districts that train leaders are pretty similar in their classes and their approach. And this is for a couple reasons. The similarity comes out of the resolution by a national convention in 1989 in Wichita, which directed or authorized districts to train deacons for preaching and pastoral ministry. And so this resolution was not just a paragraph that says, yes, deacons can be trained, but rather there's 5 single-spaced pages of details that give guidelines on how it's done. And so that resolution is actually a very thorough blueprint about how districts can train and credential deacons. In addition, the Delta program, which existed a few years ago, required 10 classes to be taught as the basic entry point for the Delta program. And so the district training programs took that into account when they established their classes. The Wichita resolution and these other elements assure that deacons are trained in good order in the Synod, and that they meet qualifications, and that there's consistency in ministry. Now, what do deacons do? Well, there's a varied answer to that because their ministry is pretty diverse, sort of like other church program staff are. A deacon will establish his ministry in a congregation in consultation. So the deacon discusses his ministry with the congregation and with the overseeing pastor, and together they establish a ministry plan for him. This is based on the needs of the congregation and also the gifts and skills and interests of the deacon. Very often the deacons specialize in one thing or another, in caregiving or evangelism or leadership or teaching, whatever the congregation may need and the deacon may have to do. The deacons are often as effective or even more effective than pastors are, and especially new pastors that come out of the seminary that don't have the background or experience that many of the deacons bring to their ministries. Now, people are worried that somehow deacons will become hot dogs and do what they want. The opposite is actually true in my experience. The people who go through the training classes are more sensitive to the difficulties of church ministry and defer to their pastors, it seems, even more than when they started. Now, our synod, there's had some controversy about whether deacons should preach, baptize, and consecrate the Lord's Supper. Now, in fact, the Synod as a whole, the whole Synod in convention in 1989, authorized men to do these things under certain circumstances. And so the Synod as a whole has already authorized those things. Now, it's interesting to see how widely accepted deacon ministry is in the Synod. Now, on the surface, it would appear that with just 10 districts training or credentialing deacons, that's a minority. However, licensed deacons serve in word and sacrament ministry in many more districts. In fact, the Synod Task Force determined that 27 of the 35 districts have preaching deacons, licensed deacons that are authorized by their district presidents to preach in congregations. That's 77% of the districts in the Synod that are authorized licensed deacons to preach. Also, 20 districts authorize licensed deacons to do word and sacrament ministry in their districts. Now, that's more than half of the districts in Synod. So the wider church has very much strengthened and accepted the ministry of deacons. And it's even more amazing to think that this has all happened in 26 years, showing rapid growth in the ministry of deacons in the Missouri Synod. Now, of course, the church, in consultation with the deacons and the overseeing pastor, determines the ministry of the deacon. And so many of them don't preach at all. That's not part of their portfolio. Now, in my experience, congregations have responded very well to deacons once they're credentialed. Now, this takes some instruction, since deacons are new to the Lutheran Church in America. It's useful to learn what deacons are biblically, and very often church leaders and pastors, as well as the congregations, need to understand those things for the deacons to especially be accepted. Now, my own congregation wrote an appendix to the Constitution in which we described what deacons do, so it was clear to everyone going in what this was. The congregations honored the training of deacons and the interview process and the involvement and credential of the district. Synodical officers, after all, vice presidents and presidents, do the interviewing and examination. And other synodical officers, such as circuit counselors, teach some of the classes. And so the Synod is intimately involved, and the congregation honors this element as well. Most congregations find that it's very valuable to have deacons preach when their pastor is unavailable for some reason. This is because preaching isn't the same as a lecture or a college. Preaching is very much dependent upon the relationship between the preacher and the people. This is very important. And so a pastor with a good relationship with his congregation will find out that his preaching is well received, even if the quality is actually somewhat poor. The opposite is also true. When there's a difficult relationship between pastor and people, then they don't like the preaching, even if it's quality, in an objective sense. And so to have deacons preach when pastors are unavailable is actually more effective than having substitute or new pastors from the outside. And in fact, the preaching skills of some deacons exceed that of many pastors. Now, there's certainly some overlap between the ministry of deacons and pastors, just as there's overlap between the ministry of DCEs and pastors. This does not cause confusion, because the congregations understand the difference, the overlap, and the separation, and so takes all that into account. Now, deacons are especially helpful in ministering in specialty congregations, that is, ethnic congregations, small or very big congregations, remote congregations, poor or urban ones. These are congregations which are least likely to have an ordained pastor there, because on the whole, pastors like to live close to the parishes in which they serve, and they like to be paid preferably full-time. And these congregations often cannot do those things. And so deacons serve in those congregations when pastors are unavailable or unwilling. Now, our need for deacons to serve in a pastoral-like capacity is going to grow in coming years. It's not going to decrease. Two things make this important to understand. One is the Synod as a whole is shrinking in numbers, which means individual congregations are shrinking in numbers and are less able to hire clergy. Also, the Synod tells us again and again for the last 15 years that there will be a pastor shortage coming up in the next few years and the decade to come as the baby boomer pastors retire. And so the need for deacons to do pastoral ministry will increase in coming years, not decrease. Deacons fill the gap of ministry in a lot of ways, whether they serve in their own congregation under their own pastor or in a separate congregation. They may serve those specialty needs of older people or of the ethnic parts of the congregation, or serving private communion in large congregations in which pastors cannot get to all these individuals. Deacons also serve in transitional times, because commonly deacons will be in their own congregation much longer than pastors will be. And so when pastors leave the congregation, they serve as a transitional ministry and keep those relationships going in a way that substitute pastors cannot. We also find that deacons serve the deacon programs as a stepping stone into seminary training or special ministry pastor training. They may enter leadership programs being almost afraid or not seeing themselves as being pastors. And yet the leadership training and the deacon experience shows them that God is calling them to that kind of ministry, calling them to a pastoral ministry rather than a deacon ministry. And so the deacons serve as a stepping stone into typical, traditional seminary training. There's one other element I'd like to address as we think about deacons. I'd like to talk about wine. We're being Lutherans, probably talk about beer. It comes in bottles, and it's fine wine or fine beer, but it doesn't do any good to us in the bottle unless it comes out. Now I see the fine wine as being like the ministry of deacons, and the bottle or bottleneck as being like pastors or church leaders. Some of us leaders are wide mouth, enables the ministry of deacons to flow freely out of it. Others of us are like narrow necks, restricting the ministry of deacons. Some of us are like corks, preventing even the ministry of deacons from coming out. Now, the more restrictive approach probably is more similar to what you see in the Catholic priesthood, some elements of which probably have carried over into the Lutheran Church. Were it not for Martin Stephan, we would probably still be led by a bishop, and only pastors would go to conventions to vote. Now, the restrictive approach towards deacons hinders their ministry and frustrates them, and hinders ministry in the church at large. The Apostle John criticized those who threw out evil spirits because he said, "There is not one of us." Jesus responded, "Do not hinder him." And so that's a good model for us as well. We as pastors, I think, need to be more willing to admit how much pride does drive what we do, how much we want control, how much we defend our turf, and how that affects our theology and the way we restrict deacons. Paul added new believers to ministry regularly. Timothy, Titus, Gaius, Aristarchus, all these were new believers he brought in the ministry with much less knowledge and background than the deacons that we have that want to minister among us today. District leadership can enable or block the ministry of deacons. Some synodical officials at the district or national level want to eliminate or at least control what goes on in leadership training. This harms the growth of the ministry. In fact, the sort of grassroots approach to ministry through the districts enables the growth of the ministry. Now, synodical officials who don't micromanage what college or seminary professors do may want to manage what people do in the districts. But the fact is that many lay training teachers, like myself, not only have synodical training, but we have doctorates or advanced degrees, and more parish experience than a whole lot of professors have. And so that should be respected. Now, the church at large, every church body, it seems, has a deacon-like office. Now, they go by different names, but they amount to the same thing. It's people at a lower level than a typical ordained pastor who carry out certain pastoral functions, usually including preaching and the sacraments. They follow the same mode that we do, requiring training, examination, credentialing, and oversight. Now this tells me that there's a need in the church at large for this kind of ministry, and that the Holy Spirit is at work prompting this solution to ministry needs, that which we see embodied in deacons. Now in the Lutheran Church, there are certain traditions we have that have strengths but also weaknesses, and sometimes hinder ministry in ways that they shouldn't. One of those traditions we have is academics. Currently, all the pastors who come out of seminary have master's degrees, not just bachelor's, but master's degrees. This wasn't true in the generation before mine, in which a bachelor degree was a typical seminary degree. Now, this has created an expectation that in order to be prepared, our pastors have to have seminary master's degrees. Now, this hinders ministry, and especially hinders older men, especially second career men, who are older, often have no college degree at all, or who are ethnic pastors who know little English. The academic requirements are onerous to them and hinder them from doing ministry rather than assisting them. Deacons have a working knowledge of ministry, not a comprehensive one, but ordained pastors have no comprehensive knowledge of ministry either. And we find out that when we're in ministry year after year, there are more and more demands that come up. There are skills the seminary didn't teach and social trends that change. And so it's important that we keep expanding our skill base and knowledge. That's what deacons do as well. When it comes right down to it, church ministry is pretty simple. Love God, love people, read the plain word of God because it's plainly spoken, and teach it accordingly with God's authority. Now, the Lutheran confessions are also a strength that can become a weakness when we speak about deacons. Lutheran confessions mention deacons, but they don't describe them in any detail. And so some people think, well, if they're not described in the confessions, then we are better off not having them at all. But you know, the confessions were written to the 16th century and reflect those concerns, especially departing from the Roman Catholic Church. There's a lot that we wish we were in the confessions, but are not. The confessions don't, in detail, address atheism or world missions or deacons. The confessions don't address in detail the rapture or dispensationalism or believer's baptism. The confessions don't list the particular parts of the divine service. They do not describe DCEs or district presidents. And yet we find we have to address those things and develop them in the church, even though they're not in the confessions in detail. Gaps in the confessions were not meant to be prohibitions. And so is true with the ministry of deacons as well. In fact, what the Augsburg Confession in 14 describes as the proper call, the steps of that really match the steps of calling deacons. And we have levels of ordination, SMP, general ministry pastors. And we need to credit and increase the ministry of deacons rather than hindering it. Now there's more information on this available in synodical circles. Of course, there's the details of the 1989 Wichita Resolution 3.05b. Now, it isn't like a normal resolution, just giving us a paragraph. It has 5 detailed pages of how to go about training and credentialing deacons. It's good reading. It's based on the Lay Worker Study Committee report, which also has useful details into it from a synodical national perspective. Actually, layman preaching predates Wichita. Seminarians have done that for a long time, even though they aren't ordained. And the 1986 handbook, bylaw 6.97, also authorized certain people to be preaching even if they weren't ordained and seminary trained as pastors. I recommend to you my DVD and my written presentation, Controversy on Deacons in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. This answers the task force report that came out in summer of 2015. The task force report recommended that all deacons be terminated in 2 years. You know, we think that's wrong and would hinder ministry. And so my presentation answers objections to deacons and shows how it's widely accepted in the wider church and performs a good ministry. So I recommend to you my video and DVD and print versions of this. Send me an email and we can provide those to you. In the meantime, God bless your ministry, the ministry of you pastors and deacons and other church leaders, and of the church at large. God bless you in your ministry in Christ's name.